Hello and welcome. Today we're going to build a contactlist app with React and Tailwind CSS. We'll be using functional components in React and React hooks, so this course assumes that you have knowledge of both. But even if you don't, you should still be able to follow through. We'll also be introducing Tailwind CSS, and you'll see why it's a very useful CSS utility. Lastly, we'll learn how to use the React fetch hook to fetch data in our application. If you're watching this on YouTube, I've left the course outline in the video description, so feel free to skip to whichever section you'd want to start from. I'll also leave a GitHub repository link to our Tailwind and Create React app setup, in case you don't want to do it from scratch. Please do me a favor and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I really need your support. Hey, alright. We're going to be using Tailwind CSS to style our application. And I know that on first glance, you're probably wondering why this looks so complex, and you're like, I'm really not going to be doing this because it looks really complex on first glance, like so much CSS inside the HTML, so much styling and all that. But I promise you, just give it a try. I had the same reaction. First of all, myself, I was like, I'm never going to use Tailwind CSS. I don't like this. This looks ugly. But right now, looking at it, it's easy to understand for me because I actually understand what every class here does. So just give it a try. First of all, look up here. If you can suppress the urge to retch long enough to give it a chance, I really think you wonder how you ever worked with CSS any other way. And that's actually the truth. So we'll be using Tailwind CSS for this course. I'll introduce Tailwind CSS to you, and I'll tell you how I learned Tailwind CSS and how it can be easy for you to learn too. Now, here's what we're going to be building. This is a contact list application. So we have like a random contacts at first, Anthony Fauci, you have the image, you have the different cards, email, phone number, and city. Then we can also filter the data we have here. So firstly, we have 10 cards here, but we can decide to get all contacts that start with A. And we just type A in there. We can see Anthony Fauci, Andy Franklin, and all the contacts out of 200 contact data that start with A. Then, if we decide to go further and search for only AN or ANT, Anthony, you see that we can do searches like this. So Anthony for that, ANT, and we have Anthony, Ever Grant, ANT and Grant, Martin Grant, Tovio Rantala, Leon Santos, Rantala, and all that. So let's see if we have an ADA here, so ADA, and you can see no data matches your search for that. So this is how our contact list app works. We want to get all the data that start from letter B. We type in B and we have that, or C. I want to search for just Charlie, and we have Charlie right here. So that's how it works. And we're using React for this and Tailwind CSS. Or we'll be fetching our data from the random user generator. So this is an API that generates a random user data. You can see here how to make a call to this API, and then we get our user data. Or we can also request multiple users. So for example, in our application, we'll be requesting for 200 users. Right here you have this randomuser.me/API, then results is equal to 5,000. So if you want 200, this will be 200. Finally, you have your turn. So there are some things I've left out in the application that I'll need you to work on yourself so that you can use that to reinforce your learning and strengthen your knowledge. So this repository contains the final code base of what we'll be building, and right now it's private, but it'll be public by the time I publish this video. I'll need you to work on these tasks. So you add a refetch button that refetches data when it is clicked, add a navigation back to the page, display number of search results for a particular query, and so on and so forth. So I need you to work on this so that you'll be able to reinforce your learning and strengthen your knowledge. I'll advise you to only come to this repository after you're done with the course. Now let's go over to our text editor or IDE and set up React. Okay, right now I'm in my terminal and I've navigated to the directory where I want to create my React application. So what I'm going to do next is generate the React application using Create React app. And to do that, write npx Create React app and the name of our project. And that is done. The next thing we're going to do is navigate to the React contact list directory. and open it up in our editor of choice. So I'm going to be using the WebStorm IDE. You can use whichever editor you want. Okay, we've successfully created our React application. Next, let's see how to set up Tailwind in our app. Now, a good way to set up Tailwind is through the Tailwind documentation. When you come to the Tailwind documentation, you can search for Create React App. And here we have a guide for setting up Tailwind with our Create React application. First, we'll have to install the Tailwind and PostCSS compatibility build. I'm going to copy this and go over to the terminal. Back to our terminal, we'll paste this, and we have that successfully installed. The next thing we're going to do is install Crackle. So let's copy this and go back to our terminal. Now, these installations might take a while, so if yours is taking longer than expected, don't worry, just wait a little more. Now, the next step is to replace the start, build, and test scripts with the Crackle start, Crackle build, and Crackle test commands. So we'll do this in the package.json file. Inside the package.json file, we'll come over to line 16, 17, and 18. Let's paste what we copied. Now, let's create a crackle.config.js file at the root of our project and add the Tailwind CSS and all the prefixer as PostCSS plugins. So we're going to copy this code, go back to our IDE, and right inside the root directory, we'll have to create a crackle.config.js file. So this is a JavaScript file. We can just go straight to JavaScript and then crackle.config. And nice, we want to add this to Git, and we'll paste this. Okay, with that done, let's generate our tailwind.config.js file. Inside the terminal, we'll run the code npx tailwind css init. Nice, that was successful. Next, we'll go over to the tailwind.config.js file that's just been generated and configure the purge option with the pass to all of our components. This is so that Tailwind can tree shake unused styles in production build. So let's copy this green line, go back to our code base, and inside the tailwind.config.js file, we want to replace line 2. Finally, we'll go over to the src/index.css file and replace what's there with the Tailwind base, component, and utility styles. Right inside the index.css file, let's paste the Tailwind base, components, and utility styles. Alright. The next thing we're going to do is start our application, and this is one of the reasons I like WebStorm. I can easily start the application by double clicking on the start button in the npm section. Otherwise, we can also do this from our terminal. So let's go back to our terminal and run npm start. And this has successfully started our application. Next, I'm going to show you how I learned Tailwind CSS before we dive into the design for our application. Okay. Now, I'm going to take you through how I learned Tailwind CSS. Myself, I've been using Tailwind for a short period of time, so it's something you can start using right away. There's no need to come over to the Tailwind documentation to start memorizing every single class in Tailwind. The approach I'll advise you to use is the search when I need approach. What that means is, for instance, you want to create a contact card. Now you break that down. What are the different things I need for my contact card? Oh, my card needs a height and it needs a width. Now you can come back to the documentation and search for height. How can I specify height using Tailwind CSS? And you see that. So you see the different classes and the properties that these classes represent. Next, my card needs a width. So you search for width. And you can then go over to the width option. You see how to specify a width for your card. You see the different classes and the different properties. So right here, you want a width of 0px, that's W0. You want a width of 0.25 rem, that's W1. You want a width of 1.75 rem, and that's W7. Then you ask yourself the next question. How can I give my card a background? So you come back to the documentation and you search for background. And you can see background image, background position, background clip, opacity, attachment, and all that. You can click on any of these options and you see how to do that. If you want background color, you search for background color and click on background colors right there. You see the different background colors, the classes, and the properties they represent. A BG transparent is a transparent background. You want a gray background, BG gray 50, and you see that there are different shades of gray. Now, my IDE helps me out in this aspect. When choosing colors, I even want to choose 50, 100, 200, 300, and all that. Right in my editor, WebStorm shows me the different shades of colors, and I can then choose whichever one I like best. But if you don't have that in your editor, you can come over to this place and get a particular color you want, and all you need is the class. Just apply that to your element, and that's it. So this is how I learned Tailwind CSS. I needed to build an application. I outlined the different things I needed for that application, and when I get to a particular one that I don't know, I come over to the documentation and search for it. So you can do that for any property. You can do that for the margin property. You can do that for padding and all that. So margin for 0px m0, margin for 1rem m4. When you do this for a number of times, it'll be easier to remember them. And you look at the class and you see m before it, and you know that, oh, that's for margin. You look at the class and you see p, for example. So let's search for padding. You look at a class and you see p before it, and you know, oh, that's for padding. So you know that 0.5 is bigger than 0, 1 is bigger than 0.5, 1.5 is bigger than 1, and all that. You can use the documentation as your guide when learning Tailwind CSS. And that's the way I did it. That's the way I recommend for you to do it. There's no need to start memorizing all the classes, or when you need them, you get them, use them for a number of times, and you start to remember them. Now let's go over to our editor and start designing our application. Okay, just before we go back to our editor, let's have another look at what we're trying to build. So we want to build these contact cards. You can see our application has two sections, and the first one contains the search input field. You probably want to add a navigation to it later on, and the second one contains the contact cards, and each card has a profile picture. So that's a picture of the contact, the person, the name here, the email address, phone, and city. We're going to be designing one contact card, and then we'll use that for all the data. Now you can already see that we're going to be working with grids, cards, photos, captions, and form inputs. So let's go right back to our editor and get started. All right, let's start by creating a contact cards component. We'll do that in the src directory. There should be a new file, and then contactcards.jsx. Okay, let's start by creating a function. So this contact cards, you can see how WebStorm immediately suggests the name of the function from the file name. We have this as contact cards, and we want to capitalize this since it's a component. And then let's return a JSX. We'll test this out with a simple h1, and that should be hello world. Next, we'll export this and import it in the app.js file. Now over to the app.js file. We're going to remove the import statements since we don't need them anymore. We'll also remove what's currently inside the app function. So let's remove this. We should still have a div right here. And then we need contact cards on line 5. So with WebStorm, if I just start typing contact cards, I'll have that imported for me. You can see that on line 1 there. So import contact cards from contact cards. And next we want to do is test this out. As you've probably noticed, I don't use semicolons in my JavaScript code. You can see that in the contact cards.jsx file. So I like to stay consistent, and I'm going to remove it on line 8 and on line 11. Right now, the next one we're going to do is come over to line 3 and also stay consistent with our use of the arrow functions. So this should be app, and we have that. Next thing we're going to do is see what this looks like on our browser. Awesome, you can see our hello world right there. What we're going to do next is give our div a background, and we'll come over to line 5, then use the class name attribute. So with Tailwind CSS, backgrounds usually start with BG. If we want to get really good suggestions with WebStorm, in this case, we'll have to remove it from the curly brace and use just strings, so that when we type BG, and then you can see the suggestions we're getting already. And gray, you see that we have the suggestions with their color shades. So we can see all the gray colors there. We tried for black, we see black right there, and all that. So I think this was one of the things that helped me learn it so fast, because I could get real-time suggestions while I type. I did not have to always go over to the documentation to check what type of color I want. I get suggestions for almost every class. What we want right now is gray 100, and we save that and we have it right there in our browser. Now that we have that, let's break this down into sections. So we have 2 sections. I'm going to duplicate this and move contact cards over to the second section, and let's indent. And then the first section is where we're going to create our form. That's going to contain the input field for searching or filtering through our application. Let's see how to do that next. Okay, to create our input field, we need the form tag. So let's start with form, and inside of form we have input. Now this input is going to contain a placeholder, and our placeholder right now is type here to filter. I'm going to break this down so that we can see it better. So we have the placeholder, and then we close our input field. Next thing we want is a type for input field. So this is text. Finally, the class name. So this is how we're going to style it. Let's see what we have so far. Okay, so we have our input field right there. Now for the class, we want to give it a margin left. So to do that in Tailwind CSS, it's ML, and then we see the suggestions that we have so far: ML4, ML1, ML2, ML9, 10, 11, 12, and this is just like how far do you want it to go. This is ML20. We see what that represents right here: margin left 5 rem, and that's what we want. So we need the margin left of 5 rem. We do that right here, and we have a margin left. Next, we'll give it a margin top, and this should be margin top of 6. So this is it, margin top of 6. That represents 1.5 rem. Finally, let's work on the edges. So that's the border radius, and this is rounded MD. So rounded MD, that's border radius at 0.375. We save that, and you can see what we have so far. If we want to make this really visible, we can change our background to black for now and see what it looks like. So look at that right there. That's what we want for our form input field. Lastly, you can see that the text is too close to the edge of the form. So that's the text placeholder type here to filter. Let's add the padding. So that's with P and then 2. So that represents 0.5 rem. We have that right here on line 10. Awesome, that's exactly what we need. Lastly, let's add the 3 dots to type here to filter, just so it looks a little bit better. And we'll change the background back to gray. So this is gray 100. Nice. And that's it for styling our form input field. What we're going to do next is go over to the contact cards component and design our contact card. You're right. Back to the contact cards.jsx file, let's remove the hello world code we wrote earlier, and for our contact cards we're going to wrap it in a figure tag since it's composed of an image with captions. So that's what our contact cards is made up of, and this should be the image right here. So inside the figure tag we have the image first of all, and the next thing we have is the caption. So that is going to be inside the feed caption tag. We have the feed caption right here. Now let's add content to our image. So first of all, we want to give our image an alt attribute, and for this we're going to use user. Next, we'll need the src attribute. So let's go over to the already completed contact cards application and get an image from there. Over to the completed contact cards application, let's copy this image URL and go right back to our editor to use it. Back to our editor, let's paste our image URL, and we have our image right there. What we want to do next is style the figure tag, and this is so that we can see the card, we can see the image in a card. Let's start by giving our figure tag a class name, and now we want to give it a white background, but it won't really be visible because of the gray background we have right now. So once again, we'll go back to the app.js file and make this black, and this is so that we can see what we're doing while we're still designing. Then when we're done designing, we can then change it to the lighter colors, but right now we need good contrast to be able to design properly. So on line 4 we have figure class name, then we want this to be bg white. Okay, so that's the card right there, and we'll need to give it a height. So that's h and 80. You see the suggestions so far: h32, there's height of 8 rem. What we need is h80, and that's height of 20 rem. we're not going to specify a width since we'll be using the grid for application, or we'll let Tailwind and CSS grid automatically calculate that for us. So let's save this, and we have a card right there. It's more visible. Next thing we want to do is give it a rounded edge. For this is just like what we did with the input field. This is going to be rounded LG. What we did with the input field is rounded empty, and you can see the edges for the input field. Right now we want the edges to be rounded MD, and for rounded MD we have a border radius of 0.375 REM. There's also a rounded full, and this is like a full circle, that's 9999 px. We'll be using that for the image later on. So right now, rounded MG, we save that, and we have the edges of our card. So that's for the border radius. Next thing we want to do is give a card a shadow. So this is shadow MD. So there's shadow LG, shadow MD, and shadow SM. What we want right now is the shadow MD, and this represents the box shadow property. So if we hover on shadow MD right here, you can see the property of this shadow MD class. So we have box shadow right there. Let's save this, and our shadow is right there, but since this is a black background, it's not so visible. What we're going to do next is add a padding top to our card. So that's P for padding and T for top. So PT and 7. If you want to add padding all around, remember just P, and then this will apply to top, bottom, right, left. But if you want it for just the top, that's PT. You want it for the left, that's PL. Want it for the right, that's PR. So that's the way Tailwind works. Now we need PT, and that's 7. You can see that this represents 1.75 REM. That's for a pattern top. Now let's go over to styling the image. Now to style our image, we'll need to give it a width and a height. First thing I'm going to do is break this img tag so that we can see it better. And we have an img tag right there. After the alt tag, we need the class name tag, and we'll start with width of 32. You can see that that represents a width of 8 REM. Then we have age of 32, same thing, height of 8 REM. Tailwind CSS uses relative measurements a lot, and that's a very good thing. So we have W32 and H32. What we want next is make this rounded. So remember, rounded full, and we have a circle. The next thing we're going to do is move it to the center of the card. We want to center it horizontally, and for that we need to give it a margin left of auto and the margin right of auto, and we can just use the MX class for that. So MX and auto, and we have our image centered horizontally. And that's it for styling our image. Now the next thing we're going to do is style the fig caption. So this is going to contain the name of the user, their email address, their city, and their phone number. Okay, for our fig caption we need 3 P tags, and that's for the name, for the email address, and for the city. So we have the first P, and we're going to duplicate this. The first P tag is going to contain the name of the user, and let's name our user Angelina Jolie. So that's Angelina Jolie. I hope that's the correct spelling, and that's for the name of the user. The second P tag is going to contain the email address of the user. So this is going to be a.jolie@email.com. Finally, we need the user's phone number. So for phone, 800 765 3490. Don't know if that looks real. Now that's for Angelina Jolie email and phone number. We want to center the text to the middle. So we want to center both Angelina Jolie email and phone number to the middle of the card. We're going to do that in line 10. So with the fig caption tag, we have a class name, and to center text in Tailwind CSS, we'll use the text center class. This centers our text. What we want next is a margin top for the fig caption. That's just to separate it from the image. So we need margin top of 5. So empty 5, that's 1.25 REM. We save that, and we have it right there. Okay, our card is beginning to look good. Now let's go further to style the name, the email address, and the phone number. So we have P with class name, and we want to give a name a text color. So the text first of all, and then the color. which one you want to style text. You have text first of all, dash, and what style you want to apply to it. So there's text, center, text 2 times L. I don't know what that does right now, or we can click on it and then hover over it. So let's do that right now. So you see how to do this with the web store. So you hover over it and you see that this contains font size of 1.5 rem and line height of 2 rem. So I think that makes it bigger by 2. What we want right now is text and the color. So this is gray. We want the name to be gray, and or we can go through the different shades of gray. There's 700 right there. Let's use that for the name. Now we have gray 700 for the color of the name. Let's increase the font weight, and this is font semi-bold. You can see that there's font medium, font bold, font sans, and all that. So what we want is font semi-bold. Then font size, so this is text XL. Finally, margin bottom. That's M for margin and B for bottom. This should be MB2. For MB2, that's margin bottom of 0.5 rem. Okay, now that we have that, let's break this down so that it's more visible. We have P class, and then this contains Angelina Jolie. We have the email, the phone number, and the close of the feed caption tag. Next we're going to do is style line 14. So that's the P tag for email address. I will start with class name, and let's give this text gray 500. So for the name we use 700. For the email address we want to use 500, and we'll do the same thing for the phone number. So class name and text gray 500, and that's for the text color. Now let's break this down, because we also want to style the email and the phone. So the text email and the text phone, so that it stands out. We'll break this down, and we're going to wrap both email and phone in a span tag. So this is span, and we close that right here. For the email text, let's give the span a class name, and this should be font medium. So make that more legible, and we have email right there. We're going to do the same thing for line 17. Span for phone, and let's move phone right inside the span tag. Then class name, this is font medium. Nice. I almost forgot we need city. So let's duplicate this, and then indent. We have city right here instead of phone on line 21. And for city, let's say Texas, and that's for city. Now the next thing we're going to do is learn how we can put this in the grid. Remember, we don't want just one contact card. We want numerous contact cards for all our data. So we could have like 10, we could have 20 and all that. So we want to put them in a grid in our page. When it's in full screen, or we're going to make this responsive a little bit with Tailwind CSS. So that means that for mobile, we can still have this. When the screen is this size, we can still have 1. But when it's full screen in desktop view, instead of having a 1 cover the whole width of the page, we can have 4 contact cards in a row. That should look better than this. Let's go back to our code base and see how we can do that. Okay, to work on the grids, we're gonna have to duplicate the contact cards. Right now that we're using static data, we'll have to duplicate this, and when we start using data from the API, we'll have just 1 contact card. But right now, let's duplicate our contact card. So we have that right there, another one, 5, 6, 7, and 8. That should be enough. Let's go over to our app.js file, and what we want to do is style this second section that contains the contact cards. To use grids for this second section, what we need to do is apply the grid class to the section. So the grid class is from Tailwind CSS. That's the same thing as display grid in CSS. The next thing we're going to do is specify the number of columns for our grid. We can do that with grid and COLS for columns. And if we want 2 columns for a grid, that's grid calls 2, 3 columns for a grid, grid calls 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. Right now we want 4. But if we do it this way, when we go back to our browser, you can see that we have a card in a grid. But if we make this small screen, you can see that it's still 4 cards. So we want it to be 4 cards when it's in a desktop mode, and when it's in a small screen, we want just 1 card, just like we had before. Back to our code base, instead of just grid calls for, we want to specify the screen size when defining how many columns a screen should have. An easy way to do this with Tailwind CSS is by either adding SM before grid. This is for small screens. If you want it for medium screen, that's MD. You want it for large, that's LG. So when it's in the desktop screen, then we want this to be 4 columns per row. If we hover on this class in a WebStorm, we can see what's inside of it. And this uses media query with mean width of 768px. Or we can still go ahead and customize this in Tailwind CSS. So if we want MD to represent a different value, or we can do that right there. Or we can also apply for SM. So we want SM and grid calls 2. If we hover on this SM class, you can see that it's mean width with 640px. And then when it's on a mobile phone, for example, lower than 640px, we want it to be just 1 card per row. We go back to a browser, and then to a mobile view, you see what we have, 1 card per row. Finally, let's add a grid cap to separate the cards from one another. Right now, they're too close to each other. So this should be gap, and then the gap size. We want gap 6, and that's gap of 1.5 rem. When we go back to our browser, you can see that this looks a lot better. We can now reduce the browser zoom level so we have a real picture of what our application looks like. Then we'll go back to our editor and change this to gray. So that's on line 5. We want to change the background to gray of 100. Awesome. This is our application. This is what the design looks like so far. And when we go over to the mobile view, you can see that it's now 1 card per row. Amazing. Tailwind CSS makes it easy for us to make our application responsive. The next thing we're going to do is see how we can work with the random user API. So we're going to fetch data from the API and use it in our application. All right. Let's start working with the random user generator. Here we come over to our browser and make a get request to the random user/API. We can see that this returns just 1 user. What if we want multiple users? That should be random user.me/API, and then want to specify results as 200. So that's it. You can say I have an extension that formats my JSON response. This is results, and we have 200 users right here. So this is the request we want to make in our application. Let's go right back to our code base. Right inside our code base, what we want to do first of all is create a variable named URL. So this should contain the random user API URL. So this is https randomuser.me/API. Since this is a small application, we're doing everything inside the app component, but you'd probably want to do this in a separate file. You might also want to separate the navigation bar and the form input field later on. Now that we have the URL, we'll have to fetch data from it next. We can use the JavaScript fetch API, or we can use XUse for that. But the best method I found for this case is the useFetch hook, and that's from the React Fetch Hook package. To install it, we'll open up our terminal and then run the command npm i-s react fetch hook. Alternatively, depending on your editor, you can just import the useFetch hook from React Fetch Hook like we're about to do on line 2, and then WebStorm, for example, would suggest that you install it. Right there, you click on the install button and the editor or IDE does the job for you. Now that we have the React Fetch Hook package installed, let's import it. We're going to do that on line 1. Import, we want to import useFetch, and this is from React Fetch Hook. To use the useFetch hook, we'll come over to line 6 and then const. One of the structure is loading data and error from a useFetch. So this is useFetch, and inside the parentheses we'll add a URL. So this is URL. But we don't want to end at this https randomuser.me/API. We could do this. We could just go straight to add in the result query, but we don't want to do that. We want to separate the API from the query, and in case we'll need to use the API somewhere else. That's why we are doing this instead. So this is results right here, and that's equal to 200. Now the first property we have in the useFetch hook is loading. Will return a Boolean value. So if it's still trying to fetch, or if it's still making the fetch request, its loading will be true. And once the fetch request has been completed, its loading will be false. And at that point, we'll have data. And if there's an error, we'll have a value in this error property. Let's see what we have as the result from our fetch request. Right on line 7, we want to log data to the console. But we don't want to do this. We don't want to do console.log and data, because initially there'll be no data. So its loading would be true at that moment and there'll be no data. What we want to do is wait for data before we log it to the console. So this is data and console.log data. So whenever its loading completes, whenever this changes to false and there's data, then log data to the console on line 7. Let's save that, and we're going to test this out in our browser. Back to our browser, let's inspect and go over to the console. Here's what we have. We have an object and we have info from the object and results. We're interested in this results property. This contains an array of different object data. So we have this one, and this is gender male. So let's open this and see what we have inside of it. You can see the first user objects, cell phone number, so that's cell. You have email address, you have gender as male, ID, location, login name, phone, picture, and all that. We have the same thing for all the other object data, and this is what we need. The next thing we're going to do is create a state for our data. We're going to put the contact list data in our state. Okay, to create a state, we're going to use the useState hook. Let's create a state contact list. Then we have the second variable as set contact list, and this is equal to useState. You can see that that's automatically imported for me on line 3. Then we also need a state for our filter query. Remember, we need to be able to filter through the data we have in our application. So let's name this filter query and set filter query. This is also equal to useState. Alright, you can go ahead and give this a default value of null. So we have null for line 8 and null for filter query. Now here's the logic we're going to use for the application. If there's something in the filter query, then contact list is going to be equal to the filtered data. But if there's nothing in the filter query state, then contact list is going to be equal to all the data we're getting from the fetch request. Here's what I mean. So let's have the useEffect hook. You can see that it's automatically imported for me on line 3, so you have to also do that. And then back to line 11, we want to do this in a useEffect hook. Now if there's a filter query, then use the filter query here. If there's a filter query, we want to filter through the data and then set contact list to the filtered data. Else, we want to set contact list to the data we're getting from the fetch request, so data.results. But we'll use the optional chaining for this, because initially there's no data, so we can't just do data.result. This will be undefined.result, and that's a problem. So what we're saying right now is that only when there's data will you set contact list to data.result. So data, then the question mark here, right? If data is available, then let's access its result property. But if data is not available, then don't bother. That's what line 16 does. Initially, you can see that there's no filter query, and because of that, we'll have contact list as data.results. We want to add a filter query when we start typing inside this input form. Next, we'll add the dependencies for our useEffect method. So for dependencies, we have data and filter query. The next thing we're going to do is see how we can use the data in contact list in the contact cards component. And how we'll be doing that is by passing contact list as a prop to contact cards. So let's quickly do that here. Contact list is equal to contact list. Then we can go over to contact cards or GSX and use our contact list. So this is contact list. Let's see what we have in contact list by logging into the console. This is contact list and console.log contact list. Back to our browser, and we have a contact list. Alright, our contact list state works and our useEffect method works well. Now let's see how we can populate the contact cards with the data we're getting in contact list. Here you're right. To use the data from our contact list state, let's remove the duplicated contact cards we added earlier. So I'm gonna collapse all of these, collapse, and let's delete. We're gonna be working with just one contact card, but we'll wrap this in a map method. Let's do that right here. We have this as JavaScript. Then let's move the contact card inside the curly brace. So we want to move this and indent. Now what we're going to do next is a map through contact list. So this is contact list, and remember, optional chaining, we only want to do this if there's data in contact list. So alternatively, before ES7 I think we used to do this contact list and contact list.map, but right now we can just do this contact list.map. Then right inside here we have contacts. So this is for every contact in the contact list array. We also need index. We want to use the index of the iteration as the key for each contact card. So this is a function that returns JSX code. Let's take line 8 to line 28 and move that inside of our function return statement. That's it. Then we can remove line 6 and we have a contact card. If we go over to our browser, we should see 200 contact cards. This is a browser and we have 200 contact cards right now. The application I showed you earlier has 10 contact cards, and that's because right inside the useEffect method of the app.js file, this place right here we're setting contact list on line 16. I used the slice method to get only the first 10 elements, but I don't want to add that right now because of complexity. Let's stay with 200. Back to the contact cards.jsx file, we need to give each figure tag a key. If we go back to the browser and to the console, you can see that there's a warning. Each chart on the list should have a unique key prop. Let's do that for figure. So this is key and that's index. Now that we have each contact data in the map method, we're going to use the properties for contact right here on line 5 for the name, email address, city, and phone number. Okay, to access the data we have in each contact data, we're going to start with the image, and that's on line 10. For the image, that should be contact.picture.large. You can pause this video and check out the array of data so you see how you can access every property in the contact object. For the image is contact.picture.large, and we can access the name using contact.name. So right here on line 14, let's change that to contact.name. There's the first name and there's the last name. Contact.name.first and contact.name.last. Okay, that's for name. The next thing we need is the email address. For email, that's contact.email. On line 17, let's have contact.email. The next one is the phone number, so that's on line 20. Right here we have contact.cell. Finally, for city, this is inside the location property of contact. So this is contact.location.city. Alright, looks like we have all the data we need. We have the picture, we have the name, we have the email address, we have the phone number, and we have the city. Let's go back to our browser and see what we've done. Nice. Back in our browser, you can see the data we have. So this is already working really well. We have the image, we have the name. For this first person as Oku Erona, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We have email address, phone number, and city. Same thing for Roberta, Holly, Olivia, Gabriela, Hannah, Romana, Joseph, and all that. And we have the 200 results right now. If you want to limit this to 10, you'll have to use the slice method. I did that in the completed application you get in the GitHub repository, so you can check that out there. Now that we've successfully done this, the last thing we need to do in application is see how we can make this filter functionality work, so that if we want all the names to start from G, we write in G there, and we have just the names that start from G. Then if we want the names that contain GAB, we write that there, and we have Gabriela and every other name that contains GAB. So that's what we're going to do. First of all, if it's just one letter, then we get all the names that start from that one letter. But if it's more than one letter, we get all the names that include that string. So this is GAB, we're supposed to get Gabriella here and every other name that contains GAB. If we have ROB, we're supposed to get Roberta or Rob or any other name that contains ROB. So that's what we want. Let's see how to do that next. Alright, back in our code base, we're going to be working with the app.js file. Right now, we're done with the contact cards, and the contact cards will only work with the contact list data we give to it. So every other thing we need to do next is going to be in the app.js file. Right inside this useEffect method, we'll be modifying the contact list data. So this place on line 13 where we have the filter query here, that's where we want to modify the contact list data. If there's a filter query, we want to filter our data and set contact list to the filtered data. If there's no filter data, then set contact list to data.results. Right on line 13, let's start by creating a variable, and we'll name our variable query string. This is so that we can be sure that the data we're getting from the input field and the data we're getting from our API has the same casing. So this should be filter query dot to lowercase. So when we're trying to compare our data to filter it, we're sure that the one we're getting the input field is lowercase data, and the one we're getting from the API is lowercase data. So we'll also apply the to lowercase method to the data we're getting from the API when we're making a comparison. Next thing we want is the filtered data. To do that, we have const filtered data, and this is equal to, so right here is where we want to filter our data. Data, remember, only if data is available, then dot results. Now you can also apply the optional chaining right here, because you might not be sure if the results property is going to be available. So we can also use optional chaining on the result property. So that's results, then dot filter. You can also do this, use this optional chaining for every other property we've accessed so far. You can come to the contact cards or JSX file and use the optional chaining for contact.picture and .large, because we might not really trust the API to give us the exact data we want or the exact data format we want. Now we have the filter method on line 14, and we want to get contact from all the elements in the data.results property. Right inside this filter method function argument, we want to get the full name of the user first of all. This is what we're using to do our search. So full name, and full name is going to be equal to the first name and the last name. Remember to access the first name, that's contact.name.first, and to access the last name, that's contact.name.last. So this is the first name and the last name, but this is not going to work. So we have to wrap this in the backticks and use the JavaScript template literal for this. Backtick and backtick for contact.name.last. And that's for our full name. Now we can go ahead and filter our data. Remember, we want to check if the query string is just one letter. So if query string dot length is equal to 1, then we want to get the first letter of the full name. So const first letter is equal to full name dot, to get the first letter in a string, we use the character at method. So that's CHARAT, and right inside of it we have 0. So that's to get the first letter of a string. We can have 1 to get the second, 2 to get the third, and all that. So we have character at 0 dot to lowercase. Finally, we want to return our data if the first letter is equal to the query string. Notice how we converted the first letter to lowercase right here. That's so that we can be sure that we're comparing lowercase to lowercase. If the first letter right here is a capital letter and the one from our user is a lowercase letter, that won't work. So they won't be the same. That's why we're changing this to lowercase, and the one from our user is also a lowercase data. Now, if the length of the query string is not equal to 1, then we can just filter straight away. So return full name dot to lowercase first of all dot includes query string. Now the dot includes method is going to check if the data we have in query string, so if the string we have inside the query string variable or the query string state is inside the full name variable. So if the full name method contains what we have in the query string, then you're going to return that data for us. For example, if it's Angelina and then query string is GEL, that means that GEL is inside Angelina, and then Angelina is going to be returned to us. And that's it. That's what our filter query looks like. The final thing we're going to do inside our filter query if statement is to set our contact list data. We're going to do that on line 25. Right here, we have set contact list as filter data. So that's what we have on line 25. If we go back to our browser, this won't work just yet. And that's because filter query is still empty. We're not using this set filter query method just yet. To use that, we'll have to come over to the input field tag, and whenever a user types something inside the input field, we want to immediately set the filter query state. So here's how to do that. We're going to add the onChange attribute, and on change we want to set the filter query method to whatever the user types inside the input field. This is going to be a function, and our function returns the set filter query method. So in order to access the input value for this particular input field, we're going to use the event property. I'm going to remove this parenthesis since it's just one parameter we have in a function. Right now we have set filter query as event.target.value. This should give us the value of the input field. Look at this right now. On change, that means that whenever a user types something inside the input field, then set filter query to the value of the input field. So event.target.value should be filter query. Now we can save this and go over to our browser to see if this works. All right, here we have the contact list in our browser. Let's try to use the search input field to filter through our data. What if we want only the names that start from S? Let's type S inside here, and look at that. We have Susanna Turk, Stella Gonzalez, Sophia Holt, Sarah Boyd, and all that. So all the names we're getting start from S. If we want all the names that start from A, we have A for Ariana, that's Ariane, Aileen, Kelly, Anton, and all the other contact data. What if we want just Ariane? So that's Ariane. For Ariane, we have Ariane Wilson and Ariane Begeron. I hope that's the correct pronunciation. If you want Axeli, that's Akseli for Axeli. If you want to search for just Elena, and we have Elena right there. Now let's see if there's a Jane in our contact list. So this is Jane. Look at that. This returns nothing for us. What we want to do next is tell our user that there's no data that matches their query when they try to search for something that is not in our contact list data. So they try to search for something that we don't have. We write a message here and say no data matches your search. We're going to see how to do that next. To tell our user when there's no data that matches their search, we'll have to come over to the second section, and then we want to add a condition and say contact list dot length. So this will only apply if there's contact list, the contact list data is available from the API. Now if contact list dot length is less than 1, then we should display this. So that's h1 and no data matches your search. All right, let's test this out. Back to a browser, we try to search for Jane again, and look at that, no data matches your search. We want to search for Elias. We have Elias right there, so Elia and Elias. We want to search for Aubrey, Aubrey, and we add something else, no data matches your search. And that's it. Our application is working really well so far. We can filter through our data, we can get only the names that start from a particular letter, and we can get the names that contain a particular string. Next, let's see how you can extend the application in order to dive more deeply into Tailwind CSS and strengthen your knowledge so far. Hey, you're right. Now it's your turn. You can access this project board by going to the project section of our GitHub repository. I'll also leave a direct link to this project section in the description of this video. Now, these are things I'd like you to do in order to extend the application. You can find them in the to-do section. The first thing I'll need you to do is to add a refresh button that refreshes data when it is clicked. Right now, if you go back to our application, you can see that we have a particular number of data. That's 200 random data from our random user API. What if we want a different 200 data? We'll have to refresh. So whenever we refresh our page, you can see that the data we're getting is different. What if there was no need to manually refresh by hitting the Ctrl-R key or clicking on the refresh button of the browser? Or what if we could just have a refresh button right here in the application, and whenever we click on that refresh button, the API request is sent again, and then we have a new set of data? That would be really awesome. So I'd love you to try that out, and if you try it out and you can't do it, just let me know and I'll create a video for it. Now we also have a navigation bar for the page, so I'd like you to add a navigation bar to the page so that it stands out and look a lot better. Also, I'll need you to display the number of search results for a particular query on top of the page. Right here in the browser, if I search for ROSA, I want to see that it's just one person that's named ROSA. So somewhere on the top of this page, I have one search result for Rosa. What if I have just B? I should see somewhere on the top of the page that we have, this is 8, that we have 8 contact data that start from B. So they should show the number 8 somewhere in the middle of the page, or however you choose to design it. That'll be a really awesome addition. Then for the last two cards, we're going to make use of this is loading variable and the error variable we have declared right now. You see that there's a warning, and that's that we have a declared variable that we're not using. So I want you to try to use this is loading variable and the error variable. So for the last two cards, first of all, you display an error message if there's a problem fetching the data. So that means that error should have something in it. And then you add a load animation while data is being fetched. To do this is similar to what we have here. So this is a condition, right? If the contact list length is less than 1, display something. You can have that here and say if is loading, then display something. You can have a loading animation, an icon, or an SVG file for that. We can also do that for the error message. So I think that should be error, and you display something right there. I've already done it for you, but try to do that. That'll make your application look a lot better than it already is. And that's it for your turn. Once you're able to do this, let me know in the comment section. You can send me the final result of your project on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or on Facebook. I've left the link to all my social media handles in the description of this video. I'd love to see your final project. Now let's wrap up. Hey, finally, we're done. In this course, we've learned how to build a contact list app with React and Tailwind CSS. We use hooks for our state management, and we also saw how we can use the React fetch hook package to fetch data from the random user API. We learned how to set up Tailwind CSS with React, and we also learned how to learn Tailwind CSS, or at least how I learned Tailwind CSS. Thanks to WebStorm for making the process easier. Don't forget to check out the project board for our application and work on the recommended additions. In my opinion, that's the best way to learn, and I hope you try it out. When you're done, share your completed project on Twitter and mention me. I'd really love to see it. Please, I beg you, like this video and subscribe to my channel on YouTube. See you.